Hey everyone, Rose here, and welcome back to another video. Since it's October, I figured it would be a good time to make a fall-themed sculpt. So today I'm making a fall dragon, specifically a pumpkin dragon. Before I started, I made a couple of sketches in Krita to figure out the idea and the general design, and I came up with this. So, with that, off to Blender. To begin with, I added a couple of spheres and used the snake hook tool to shape them into the basic shapes for the head, neck, and horns. And then I moved them around and started adding a bit more detail. By the way, you might notice my Blender looks a bit different from what you might have. That's because I'm working in the Blender 2.91 alphas, and there are a couple of new changes to sculpt mode and a couple of new features that I'm using that you won't have unless you are in the alphas and have the experimental features turned on. By the way, if you're interested in my process and the kind of brushes that you use and the settings, especially in the experimental versions I'm using, I plan on making a video on that sometime soon, so keep an eye out for that. Anyway, now I'm done with the very basic blocking, so I start adding some more detail and refine the general shapes of the face. I added in the jaw and added in like the eye sockets and the cheekbones and the mouth and stuff like that. This dragon has a really big underbite. I kind of like how that looks. It looks kind of cute, I think. But yeah, I continue working, I refine the shapes. Here I'm adding the eyeballs and eyelids. I usually add those in as separate objects. For the eyeballs, I keep them as separate objects throughout the sculpt and even in the end result. For the eyelids, I'll merge them in later, but it's easier to work with them as spheres to begin with. So I'm just refining my details. I remesh every once in a while to add more geometry so that I can add smaller details. For this dragon, the main details are all these creases and the little ridges that make the surface look kind of like a pumpkin, which is the idea for this dragon. And that's where it goes. I also add some details into the horns to make them look like pumpkin stems, and then later on I do the neck and stuff also. At this point I start working on the leaves. The dragon is going to have leaves all around the back of the neck and on the cheeks, or rather the jaws. And I use the mask extract tool to get the shape of the leaf. Had a solidify modifier on there to get the thickness, and then I copied it around the mesh to the places where I wanted the leaves, and then I sculpt them with multi-res to get all the details in. And I usually don't work with multi-res, but in this case, since it's a very thin object and I'm not changing the general shape much, I really found it very useful to use it in this case. I also move to the face every once in a while and add some of the leaf texture to the jaw and a little bit around the top of the head later on. That way there is a smooth transition between the pumpkin-y part of the face and the leafy part of the back of the neck and the cheekbones. Here I'm making those same transitions to the top of the head, so that the leaves have a smooth transition up there too. I also move around and add some details to the face every once in a while. I usually don't do everything step by step, but rather move around and do different things at different points as I feel like something needs work, or I need some more time to think about something. Now I'm moving on to the neck. I originally wanted to make the neck also look kind of leafy, but I changed my mind and decided to make it more pumpkin-y like the face, and I think that turned out better in the end. For the leaves along the center, I turned off symmetry so that it doesn't look too perfect but stays nice and organic. However, for the leaves along the sides, where you won't really see both of them at once, I turned on the mirror modifier and set the mirror object to the neck, so that way I didn't have to work twice for something that doesn't really show up much in the final result. I then make a second leaf. I use the exact same technique as I did for the first, since that worked out pretty well, just to add a little bit more variation. And I copied around all the leaves and added a bit more detail until I was happy with how it looked. For this part I also had quite a few references. I had references of both pumpkins for the texture and surface of the face, as well as references of just piles of leaves lying around, so I had a good feeling of how it would look. At this point I'm pretty happy with how the overall leaves look, so I add a couple of more sculpted leaves to the body to smooth out the transition again. I also try and chop off the bottom to get a smooth edge, but I couldn't really find a way to make it work, and later on I decide to add shoulders anyway. Here I finally add some detail to the eyes. I just remesh them to add a bit more topology and sculpt in the pupils. And at this point I apply all the modifiers to the leaves and merge them with the body. I make a couple of adjustments and then I remesh them to make everything one mesh. That way I can blend them in properly and there isn't really this awkward transition where there's just an overlap between the two meshes. The goal here was to make it where it doesn't look like there were ever several different objects, but everything is just one coherent sculpt. this stage I also add a bit more detail to everything since I've remeshed it at a fairly high poly count. I also turned off symmetry and added some details to the horns and the rest of the face so that it looks nice and organic and not too perfect and symmetrical. And now I'm finally happy with how the sculpt looks, and I start with color. I start by blocking in a basic orange and then go in with a darker shade of orange to all the deeper spots with the creases and folds I'd made. And when I'm done with those, I take a lighter yellow and do the same thing with the protruding bits. So in the end it adds a bit more shading and makes the whole thing more interesting to look at. I also add flat colors to the horns, though I don't detail them till later, and I paint in the eyes. I also add a darker color for the nose and the mouth and highlight the edges with the light color again. Then I repeat the same process around the neck until that's also nice and shaded. Now that I'm pretty happy with how the pumpkin-y parts look, I move on to the leaves. I start with adding a bit of color all over the place, and then I concentrate specifically on the ones that are around the face. I pick out a nice red and yellow and just add very flat basic colors, and then I go in with darker and lighter shades to highlight the edges and add some gradients all over the leaves. And when I'm happy with those, I go and apply a very similar process around the remaining. I block everything in with a fairly flat red first, and then I start going in with lighter and darker colors to add detail and depth until it looks like a stack of all kinds of mixed leaves. For the whole painting process, I have symmetry turned off because part of the mesh is already not symmetrical, and I want the whole thing to look organic and not super mechanically even and symmetrical. And when I'm done with the basic colors, I go in and add some more details and the veins on the leaves. They don't have to look completely perfect, since it's going to look a bit blurrier when it's rendered anyway, but they really add a bit more interest and make the leaves look a lot less flat and boring. And now that I'm finally done with the head and neck, I add a quick bit of detail to the horns. I also highlight the edges and darken the ridges and creases as I did for the main body. Then I add a bit more details to the eyes, and at this point I do a little bit of color filters to make the colors look a little bit better. And I decide I actually want this to be a full bust, so I also sculpt in some shoulders. Here's also one of the points where Blender starts being a little bit crashy, but it didn't matter much since I have autosave on. I don't really lose that much progress. For sculpting the shoulders, I turned off my vertex paint and switched back to the matte cap. That way I can concentrate on getting the shapes to match and don't have the colors that are distracting me. And I pretty much just extended everything down. I didn't add any more leaves to the back, I just transitioned out of the leaves. And I made everything textured like a pumpkin. Now I merge them together and turn vertex colors back on and paint the body. I use the same technique I did for the head and neck. The colors don't quite match because I had used the color filters on the head, but in the end it doesn't really matter because you can barely see it. Now I do a little bit of work to break up the symmetry and make a couple of tweaks so it looks a bit more interesting. I mostly use my snakehook tool to push and pull a few parts around, and then it's off to shading and rendering. For the basic material, I just added the vertex paint as a color to the principled shader. And then I move into the lighting setup. I have the point light as my key light and a sunlight as a backlight, and then I add an HDR later on for the fill light. I also add a bit of subsurface scattering to the whole dragon, so it looks a bit smooth, a bit more interesting, but I changed that around a bit later. For the HDR, I also changed the color because I prefer a bit of a purple and there aren't really purple HDRs. And then I go back to shading. I add a bit of ambient occlusion and some noise. I also add a second light to the front so that everything is a bit brighter. I also messed around with having the reflection in the eye be a mesh with an emission shader on it, but later on I changed my mind and made it just a second object with glass. I also added a couple of noise textures to the dragon as bump and as just extra color, just to make it a bit more interesting. I also have a black plane as the background, though I switched that out later for the plane I used for my last sculpt, so that way I didn't have to remake the gradient. At this point I decided I really wanted to mess around with the subsurface scattering, since leaves have quite a bit of translucency, but pumpkins don't unless they're carved. So I made a second vertex group and painted in a black and white mask to mask out where I wanted a bunch of subsurface scattering and where I wanted very little. I also had quite a few crashes around here. There are a couple of bugs, I think, with working with several vertex paints at once, but in the end I got it to work and it was quite worth it. It really adds to how the whole model looks. And I do a couple of more finishing touches, clean up some edges, and add some details to the horns and stuff. And here I add the second object to the eyes to make them reflective and shiny, and with that the model is done. I had a lot of fun making this model. It was very interesting to make. It's kind of similar to the dragon series I painted a while ago with the different portraits of different elemental dragons, just that this one is very specific and pumpkin-y. I really enjoy the result. I think it turned out really nice, and I hope you guys enjoyed the process as well. If you guys are interested in seeing the video where I describe my settings and stuff, subscribe so you get notified when it comes out. And otherwise, I have a Discord server, so if you're interested in sharing some art, or just hanging out, or getting critiques, or seeing my art a little bit early, and also seeing like work in progress stuff, then join me on there. I'll put the link in the description. Otherwise, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and see you all next time.